And now we're at a stage where we can actually start to hand render. So we're looking at the sketch content layer. This layer must be selected when any of the selection of the sketch is being carried out. It's because this layer holds the content of the original sketch. So I'm going to concentrate on the front panel, this front housing that we have here. Okay, so looking at this, I can see that the border of this sketch, okay, is completely filled in. So this should work out pretty okay. I'm going to use the fuzzy select tool. I'm going to click inside an area within the front housing. And depending on how the sketch works out, you may see that some elements are not picked up, and also some elements are completely enclosed by another boundary. In this case, I need to hold down the shift key on the keyboard, and you can see the cursor has the plus symbol being added to it. This means that I'm going to add to the selection. So I can go around and start to add any pockets of data that weren't selected initially by the fuzzy select tool. I may also include this section here, okay, but looking at that, I may notice there's a gap there. Okay, so there's a gap somewhere in this content, and I think I can see it there, so I won't use this selection. I'll leave the front selection as is. Now you can see these small gaps here. Again, I can add to them as best possible, but one of the steps that's going to happen next is the grow option, and what will happen is it will take the border of the existing selections and it will increase them by a number of pixels. Now these small gaps that we see here, the width of these gaps here is normally smaller or equal to the amount that I'm going to grow the selection by. So in essence, the selection will grow in on top of itself and these elements here will disappear. So I've used the fuzzy select tool from the working sketch content layer, and I've picked an area that I want to use. And the next important step is that I'm going to grow the selection. So from the select pull down menu, I'm going to grow the selection by, let's say, 2 pixels. And if you have a look at the selection now, you can see it has expanded, and it now sits all the way along here. In here has tidied itself up, and I have a reasonably good outline down around the lamps or lights that have been added into the sketch. I have a fairly big gaping area here, so I might try and add that in as a selection now, something that I missed earlier on. I might grow the selection again. Now this is going to grow the selection too much. Notice the way the selection is outside the boundary now, so now I may actually shrink by 2 pixels. What you will notice is that it's gotten rid of the selection in here. So by consuming the selection internally and then shrinking, I still maintained this idea. So now that I have this selected, critical step. The critical step now is that I move to a different layer before I do any rendering. So I'm now going to add the content of pixels in this painting process or rendering process, but I'm adding them to a different layer, one of the layers that is sitting below the working sketch content. Also, by isolating this area here, it means that any sketching that I do add cannot permeate outside into other areas of the sketch that I don't want it to. Now, as far as the rendering process and the style of the render that we're going to add, this is a personal creative technique. It depends on what style of brushes you want to use. So if I go to the paintbrush tool, we can see that we can choose from a number of the default brushes. Now this is the default brush set within GIMP, and it's not a very comprehensive list whatsoever. Okay, it's very small. And dealing with another area of customization of GIMP, we can figure out how to develop or expand this set to give us a lot more freedom and a lot more scope. But for the meantime, I'm going to use some of the brushes on this from this standard set. So I'm going to choose one of these angled brushes. And you can see when I choose the brush that it gives me the current size of the brush, and you can see the outline of the brush. It's quite big at the moment. Using the square brackets keystrokes on the keyboard, the left bracket will decrease the size and the right bracket will increase the size. So depending on, again, this will come up with practice and styles that you may want to incorporate. You now have a look at the the paintbrush options. The mode is normal, so it'll paint as normal. Opacity, okay, this can be quite useful, especially when using the airbrush techniques. And the 100% opacity means that it's a solid red brush. If I place two brushes on top of each other, you can see there's no difference. There's no outline or overline that you see there. And if I was to change the brush opacity to, let's say, 50%, and if I was to sit brushes on top of each other, you can see the accumulation of the colouring when brushes are placed on top of each other. You can see the transparent effect given there. So opacity definitely is something that adds to the sketch rendering process. The brush type we've just selected from the pull down menu. The scale we've introduced not via the slider. We could use a slider if you wanted to, but my own personal preference is to use the square bracket keys on the keyboard to develop the size of the brush. As far as the brush dynamics are concerned and any of the other options, we'll worry about them at a later stage. So now I'm going to take this brush and I'm going to start to actually add content. Okay, so you can see simple brush strokes across the area. Even if I take the brush outside of the selection, the selection doesn't add, because the isolation has taken out that option. I can't add outside of this selected area, so I'm isolated or confined to only this section to which I can now add content. Now if I was to zoom back, you can see that and deselect, you can see that the selection is quite tidy. You can see the rendering effect there. You can see the opacity has taken numerous strokes on top of it. Because the information is on a separate layer, I can always turn the layer on and off to see what the effects look like. Okay. That is one single step of the digital rendering process. It requires a selection from the working sketch content. It requires a grow or shrink of pixels. It requires switching to a different layer, and then it requires the application of the rendering itself. So if I was to take, let's say, the carousel, if I was to take that area, which is up here, so I take the fuzzy select tool from the working sketch content and I click inside there. Now you can see the selection there. Now looking closely at the selection that's picked up, you can see the way it's not picking up the faded, the grey pixels. This is why we expand the selection by 2. So then you can see that the selection is sitting inside the actual sketch line, which means that when I paint underneath this, I don't see any jagged edges from the colouring. So I don't see any white spaces from the colouring. So let's say I take a different colour. Let's say I take a yellow. And if I take a different brush as well. So I'm going to choose maybe one of these faded fuzzy brushes. Okay. So I have selected from this layer, I have grown the selection. Now I need to switch to a different layer before I apply. Okay. And if you have a look at the application of this, you can see the airbrush style. Okay, so it's manual brush strokes. And depending on how many strokes you apply, and depending on the opacity, and depending on the size of the brush, gives us the graffitied effect, almost the lightened effect. If I was to undo through all of those brush strokes, and if I was to make the brush a lot wider, okay, the application of one stroke, okay, creates a very faded effect. So you can add touches of colour and then come along with a more darker or more opaque, more solid brush with a finer edge, and you can start to apply more definition at certain corners. So this is how airbrushing would take place in the real world. You get a fine brush or fine spray, and then apply you start off with the lighter spray or the less dense spray, and then you would apply further brushes to increase the definition. So if I was to zoom back from that, you can see the idea. If I took a very opaque version of that, it's not changing the color, it's changing the transparency. And if I was to just add a small number of dashes inside the area. You can see that painted effect now. So in this case here, I've used two different styles of brushes. One is a very brushstroke marker effect almost. This one here is the airbrush effect. How you use both of these, again it's personal preference. If I take the side panels, so again I go back to my working sketch content, go back to the fuzzy select, and if I take the side panels, again I'm going to use the shift key to select more than one element, zoom in to make sure. Maybe I might need to select a few more of those areas there. Grow the pixels. Again, the growing of the pixels will remove all of these jagged edges inside. Okay, so now I have a much more defined edge. Choose a color, maybe an orange. Okay, and then again go back to the paintbrush tool, maybe choose a different type of brush, maybe one of these. Okay. And again, depending on the scale that's required, using the square brackets to bring down. Now in this case here I'm going to make it quite opaque. Okay, and I'm going to use the shift key. Now the shift key, okay, maybe make it less a bit more. The shift key, you will notice, gives me straight line sketches. So you get the effect of precise brush strokes. So as you add more and more straight lines, you get the effect of the build-up. So it's a slightly different effect. It's almost a mixture of the airbrush technique and the manual brush strokes. So again, just to go back over how those sketches were, how those lines were drawn, I was using the shift key. So the shift key gave me straight line sketches. So rather than have the manual jagged kind of rough approach, I can take click once, hold down the shift key, notice the line that's being connected, and I get a single brush stroke. And I keep on adding these. Again, the benefit here of having the selection outside the line, or having the ability to select outside the line, means I don't get any of the rough strokes. So again, I can keep on adding to a certain amount of them. It adds the definition across. So now you can see you're starting to develop a style. And again, at any stage, these layers can be turned off. We can have a look and we can see, well, okay, classic mistake. Okay, looking at that there, I've drawn all of this on the wrong layer. So I really should undo all of those, because it's a terrible mistake to do. So because I've damaged the original, I should really go back, undo all. The benefit here is that GIMP has a very long undo list. So now go back and switch to the side panels layer. It's a very critical mistake, but very, very easy to do, as you've seen. So I now go back and I apply the same IDs, and the more I overwrite certain pixels, the darker or more dense they become. So I can actually zigzag backwards and forwards to make these areas here far more dense. Okay, so now I can see when I deselect and I have them on a separate layer. Okay, that's exactly the way they should be. And you would repeat this process over and over for all the different areas that you want. Now you may think that it gets quite tedious after a while, but considering the flexibility we have, considering how much time and effort we can put into precise hand rendering, and the fact that if we make a mistake we can easily fix it, it far outweighs the idea of taking the rendering on a physical sheet of paper with pens and paper, or with pens and markers. So many mistakes can be made and so many mistakes can be fixed. Developing your own personal style of sketching is really important and a real time saver.